Jonee Coleman Brigham. I'm one of the co-instructors of the Power Systems Journey class. I'm here talking with Shane Stennes. Um, Shane, could you introduce yourself, your name, your affiliation, and any other thing you want to share?
Yeah, happy to. Joni, it's good to see you. My name is Shane Stennes, and I am the Chief Sustainability Officer for the University of Minnesota system. I work across all of the University of Minnesota's 5 campuses and other operations around the state to lead strategic initiatives and programs around our goal to build a fully sustainable future.
Great, thank you. And what have you been up to lately?
Yeah, so as part of our work or my work around this effort to lead our initiatives around building a fully sustainable future, a big focus for me in the last months and years has been around climate planning for each of our campuses. We run about 30 million square feet of facilities across the state of Minnesota, predominantly located on our 5 campuses where we educate students and do research. And those campuses have all pledged and made a commitment. The universities made a commitment to eliminate our emissions that contribute to climate change, and then to adapt and make resilient our campuses to climate change effects as place-based institutions. So we've been going through a planning process on each campus to help develop those roadmaps for how we're going to eliminate emissions that come from our buildings, come from our transportation sector, um, come from sort of our land use on campuses, and then really thinking and working on strategies for knowing that as place-based institutions, we can't pick up and move, that we're going to be subject to whatever impacts climate change may bring, that we really need to be adapting and modifying our existing infrastructure, our natural environments, and then building up the social strength and systems to be prepared to respond to and really deal with the impacts that climate change will deliver to our communities and to our infrastructure.
Let's start with history. What are the lessons do you think that we can learn from energy history to inform the future?
I think that the lessons that we can learn from energy history to inform the future, the one that really kind of comes to mind for me is just how um, it often seems like progress may not be made, and that things are moving really slowly, and then all of a sudden they shift very quickly. And I think sort of the apocryphal example that lots of people focus on is the transition from horse and buggy as a primary mode of transportation to how quickly cars became part of the American landscape in the early 1900s. And we've seen so similar things play out in the energy space already, where, for a very long time, solar energy was not cost effective. It was often cost prohibitive for lots of different residential customers and users. It was prohibitive in terms of cost for business. And then now all of a sudden, it is one of the cheapest forms, if not the cheapest form in many markets of energy that we can install. And that's true for both comparing it to new generation sources that we might build, but also comparing it to, existing sources of generation that we're competing against or that solar energy is competing against. And so I think that that's kind of the lesson learned that I draw is just how quickly sometimes, how much it seems like the transition is not happening and then all of a sudden it's here. And then how do we then respond to that and react to that in recognizing that for us to then really take advantage of that very quick shift, we often need to think about, different energy sources and different types of energy generation may not fit well in our existing sort of policy landscapes, in our regulatory landscapes. And so there really is sometimes ill fit between, where the energy transition is headed and what our legacy energy systems look like, and that the underlying structures that our energy systems are built in, and I don't mean the technical infrastructure, although that's certainly a piece of it, but also the policy and the regulatory and the social infrastructure really matter a great deal. And that we need to not ignore those areas, that we need to attend to them just as much as we attend to the technology transition.
In this time of shifting energy policies and priorities, what do you think are the longer term trends?
So I think that relative to the shifting policy priorities that are happening right now and kind of what the implications are for the longer term trends, it is, despite sort of shifts that may or may not happen at a federal level or a state level, we've entered a sort of a new time where renewable forms of energy are the cheapest forms of energy that we can build. And so when we think about that, um, that feels like a very strong um, sort of bit of a momentum and inertia that is hard to imagine changing. And it feels like, now that transition is inevitable in many respects, because market forces will start to take over and are taking over and really driving us to install and rely more and more on renewable forms of energy. Um, so then that also, I think, comes with it that we need to then start thinking about how do we run and sort of maintain our energy system differently, because it's going to become more and more dependent on these other forms of these renewable forms of energy. They have certain characteristics that are different than other forms of energy that might be fossil based or might be nuclear based. And so we need to be, sort of adapting to that in terms of like what is our, kind of what are the ancillary or the services and the pieces of the puzzle that will bundle around that. I think that's one. I think the other thing is, now we're starting to see expansion into, it's not just about, sort of the initial pieces were really, I think, focused around electricity. And now we're obviously starting to go into different areas and domains, which include things like transportation, um, and home heating, and commercial and industrial heating. And all those, I think, are going to really drive some interesting shifts in the coming years and decades that will be, really part of the thing that we'll have to attend to and be sort of mindful of and be working on in a really earnest way. Because again, this transition will happen faster than we know it, and we can't move fast enough, right? We can't respond fast enough. We need to sort of have a predisposition toward action and real active engagement in this work.
What kind of energy stories do you think would engage the public to learn and care about energy transition issues?
I think the kinds of energy stories that really engage the public are when we tell them in ways and we share stories that are tangible, and relatable and really relevant for the communities that we're working with. So recently, we've been working with one of our campuses in a community in greater Minnesota, outside of the Twin Cities metro area, and they're really writing their own energy story. They're engaged actively as a community in defining like what are the things that are important to them, what are their priorities, and then building out, their aspirations and their vision for how they want to see their local energy system transform. And one of the things that's really clear about in the power of that story or the power of that experience is that they're telling their own story and they're doing it from an advantage point that I think, is different than, say, something we might hear in a Twin Cities context or another context. You while greenhouse gas emissions or carbon might be part of their equation, I don't think it's the driver for them. I think they're really focused on how do we build our own forms of rural economic prosperity. How do we think about lowering our energy costs for our most vulnerable residents and citizens in our community? How do we, start to keep some more of the energy dollars that we spend in our local communities so they can help support the school district and the city government and, sort of public services that are important to all of us. And how can that energy transition lower things like tax bills? And so, they're very focused on the economic picture of it. And I think it's just a good example of how do we craft and how do we do work that is responsive to what are the priorities for the people that are being served by that work. And so that's been a real lesson learned. And I think it doesn't mean that we always have to talk about economics in every context, but I think it goes to show that we have to talk about what's important for that community in their context and be really responsive to that and to their needs.
What values and goals do you think should inform the energy transition?
I think the values and goals that should inform the energy transition, there's a couple that come to mind. One is we have to be really mindful that as we do this energy transition, that we are not making it so costly that it's hard for people to get behind it. Because I think, and it, I kind of harken back to some things I've heard at the Public Utilities Commission in Minnesota, where they've talked a lot about, we lose our social license to make this transition if people feel like it's driving huge increases in cost. And I think the same goes for things like reliability of the energy system. We have to make sure that we're preserving those things, that we are being attentive to those things and making sure that we're doing the transition in a way that, either doesn't increase costs, or if it does increase costs, that it's delivering value that's that people can see in a real tangible way. And that, the reliability of the energy system is not impaired because of the energy transition. I think if those two things are not true, we do run the risk of losing sort of our social license to make the transition. And I mean that the we being regulators, policymakers, and people engaged in this work. I think the other kind of piece that needs to be top of mind is, how do we make sure that we don't leave anyone behind? There's a real risk of, leaving customers or leaving people stranded on, legacy energy systems that may not be viable or may not be there in 20 or 30 years. And we run a real risk of like leaving a few people left holding the bag for a lot of stranded costs. And we need to be really intentional about thinking about, that sort of potential inequity that we would create, and who is left behind, and how do we make sure that we, sort of bring them up with everyone else as we're going through this process. Um, and then I think, another kind of piece of this really is, how do we share the benefits, broadly speaking, with lots of different stakeholders. So we think about the energy transition is embodying things like energy efficiency and clean energy and electrification. Those are kind of, I think, core pillars of the energy transition, or their pieces or elements of it. And how do we share in more of the sort of opportunities for prosperity that are coming around that with a broader group of stakeholders and people? So, and that can be coming in lots of different ways. That could be coming in the form of jobs. That could be coming in the form of ownership of energy systems that is less centralized and more distributed. Um, that could come in the form of, people feeling like the energy services they're getting are better than the services that they had before, like that the shift to different energy technologies, to different forms of generation, should be adding value and not just displacing in kind. They should actually be appreciably and materially better for the people. I think that makes the energy transition way smoother, makes it much more likely to be successful, that people feel like they're getting an improvement. So the way I kind of think about this in a real tangible sense is, I own an electric car as one of, the vehicles in our household. We love it because it's a better experience than driving our gas car. It's not, for us, a driver was, it reduces pollution, it's better for the environment, but that's not going to be a motivator for all people. But I do think having a better driving experience could be a real motivator for people to want to get into electric vehicles, as an example. I think we need to think about all the points of the energy transition need to have a similar story. They need to like be an appreciably better experience than the default experience. I think this is the Buckminster Fuller quote, like, you don't displace um, the current incumbent technology by railing against it. You displace it by making something that's better and that improves people's lives. And so I think that should be our aim.
How might the energy transition reimagine our electric generation, distribution, use, ownership, and everything else about our energy systems to achieve our goals?
Yeah, I think the energy transition can reimagine the various aspects of the energy system, from generation to end use and everything in between, um, by engaging in. So I think about this sort of as a process question, and how do we engage stakeholders in this I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is like people are really busy. There's a lot going on in everyone's lives, and so we need to make opportunities for engagement and opportunities for input and involvement accessible to people who are already super taxed with all the other things that life has to throw at them. And recognize that it's coming in the sort of midst of a transition in lots of other um, critical areas of life. I think the most, kind of tangible one right now is obviously the transition in terms of artificial intelligence and how AI is increasingly becoming a part of people's lives and getting integrated in all sorts of different aspects of daily activity, and recognizing that that can be like the energy transition and AI and a bunch of other things going on. They're all change, and change can be scary, right? And change can be really unsettling. And so, attending to people's sort of emotions in that process, making sure that we're being mindful of, this is all about humans and people and, human oriented society and systems. And so that social change is really critical. I think technically, this comes back to, how do we make sure that, the energy transition as we deploy it in generation and in the transmission and distribution and, how we re-envision this is like we're trying to do the energy transition in the context of at least on the electricity side and certainly on things like natural gas, a highly centralized system that requires a lot of, sort of centralization of capital, centralization of assets, and profits and losses. And so I think that there's an opportunity there for us to think about how do we rethink the financial and ownership structures around energy, but also being mindful of, the central kind of systems have lots of advantages. And so how do we sort of balance the decentralized nature of the energy transition with the existence of central systems that we have today and recognize that they both have value, and how do we sort of optimize for each of their values without having either one really either suffer or disappear. I think that that's going to be kind of a key part of this whole process, is figuring out how do we make that shift in a way that feels graceful.
What do you want people to know about the energy transition?
I think what I would like people to know about the energy transition is that it is a real opportunity for us to think about the future that we want to create. That it is one of the most exciting stories of our time. It's maybe the defining um, sort of social technical intersection of issues in the 21st century. And that there's, at the end of the sort of the light at the end of the tunnel, if you will be that it can create a healthier, more prosperous society and world. And that there's a place for everyone in to be engaged in that transition to the extent that they want to be. So it's very accessible, it's very democratic in that regard, and that we need people to show up and participate as they're able.
So, what else is on your mind?
Oh, what else is on my mind? I think the thing that's on my mind right now is, and has been for a long time, is how do we, the transition is complex. The energy transition is incredibly complex. It requires lots of different stakeholders. Um, and we're trying to do it in a space where sort of our legacy systems, and I mean that both in terms of our social systems and our technology systems, um, may not be up for the task. And so I think that we need to be willing to think about how do we think about this as a systems problem, and really be open to innovation and experimentation around how do we do the work of the energy transition, let alone what are the technologies that are part of it. Um, so that's a really big thing on my mind. And in sort of as a sub note or a footnote to that is, I spend a lot of my time thinking about climate change and energy's impact on climate. as an important sort of contributor to carbon pollution across the globe. And um, the thing that really kind of drives me is trying to figure out how do we do this at the speed and the scale that's required. Um, and knowing that that means we have to mobilize lots of different people, lots of different actors all around the globe to do this, but also recognizing that, in my role and the role the university plays, we have, sort of a defined and limited scope, right? And so how do we show up? What are the things that we need to deliver on in order to make this transition successful, and being attentive to our piece of the puzzle so we can make sure that we're supporting other people and delivering their piece of the puzzle.
Well, this is where we transition into open discussion.
Sure.
And you've given a lot of attention to the experience of people in the energy transition, of the processes of change, response to change, the translation to values that are important to them. And I'm curious if you could say more um, about the role of the people of the university and how you think about the climate work of the university as an institution. And I'll just
Mm.
add that I think it's writer and thinker David Orr talks about the built environment as a hidden pedagogy of,
Hmm.
so uh, not only what people can see, but how the university communicates about how it is managing its facilities and how that plays into the role of the university, not just in carbon and energy numbers, but in people, in understanding and in part of your contribution in this leadership role.
Yeah. It's a great question. I think that the role of the university, I think about it in the domains are interrelated and they're not neat, tidy buckets because they sort of cross connect. But in terms of our, kind of in four parts, right? So we have a role to conduct research that is helping to develop the solutions and insights that will inform the energy transition and work on climate and climate science and insights in that piece of it. Secondly, we obviously have a critical role in educating and preparing and in helping to build competency within our students who will become graduates, who will then go out into the world. And they're our biggest sort of lever for change, right? That they have an enormous ability to impact in their future careers and in their communities if the energy transition is successful, and if so, how it gets deployed, right? So how does it unfold? Um, there's a huge multiplier effect for us. And the third piece is outreach and extension. We have an engagement. We have a incredible team of people who are constantly working with different communities and individuals and policymakers and government regulators across the state, and beyond, at a national and even international scale. And those folks and their ability to help those stakeholders and decision makers in achieving their goals and aspirations and in making informed and good choices and being a real two-way collaboration, like those folks who are policymakers or decision makers in communities of all scales, they have expertise and wisdom that is really valuable, and we have to sort of think about what our unique contribution is that we can help deliver to them. But I think that that's a critical part. But the last part you brought up in terms of the question, thinking about our operations and the campuses, right? So as physical entities, um, the campus environment has a tremendous impact on it is its own, as you said, hidden pedagogical tool, and experience. And I think really can shape, sort of like, especially our students, but our employees and our visitors as well, like what their perspective is on sustainability generally and energy transition specifically. And so we've talked about this, and I think the campus as that pedagogical tool, as that ability to experience what the transition will look like. I think about it in a couple different ways. One is if we can't get it right at the university campus, I'm not sure how we can expect others to get it right, because we have, you know, tremendous resources. And I don't just mean that financially, but we have amazing experts on the operations side. We have great faculty resources and really ambitious and talented students. And sort of stitching all those things together, we should be able to navigate our way to a future energy transition and a future decarbonized society. And if we can't get it right on our end, I think it's really hard for us to expect other entities to do it on theirs. And so I think we have a real leadership role to play in terms of just demonstrating the path ahead and de-risking that for people and taking those initial steps. I think the second thing that comes to mind for me is um, when you step onto a sustainable campus, a truly sustainable campus, I do sincerely believe it should feel different. It should probably look different than a non-sustainable or conventional campus. And I think it should evoke a different feeling and a different experience, and in a different sort of resonance with the people who are part of that community, who are stepping foot onto that community. So as an individual, you should just have a different emotive experience when you're on a sustainable campus. And so I think that from that standpoint, um, that can then really transform sort of the experience, particularly for students, and ultimately help them understand sort of what does a sustainable future look like. It looks like this. It looks like what I'm experiencing. We hope at some point we will get to a juncture where students at the University of Minnesota will say, it looks like what I'm experiencing on campus. And now that I have a mental model for how that looks, I can go visualize and build that myself in other contexts. I can do it in the community I live in. I can do it at the business I'm part of or the organization that I'm working for. And so that's what we're really hopeful for is like, how do we create this sustainable campus environment that serves as a template for others in a real way to, sort of influence and enrich the experience of the students who are part of it, and that they're engaged in creating that, right? That they're part of that process of creating that sustainable campus experience as they go through their time as a student at the University of Minnesota.
Well, as an architect, I have to say I love that perspective of the experience of the design of the place. And I'm curious, are there, if you could speak a little bit to the role of the living lab mentality or, approach at the
Hmm.
U and how that's being used, but not only in the more technical side of testing out, different technologies or grass species or what have you, um, but also is there any exploration of the living lab approach to how you might achieve this different sensation of a campus,
Mm-hmm.
experiential, or do you see a possibility for that?
Yeah. Yeah. So living laboratory is a concept that's really common, or I shouldn't say really common. Living laboratory is a concept that some higher education institutions have deployed to sort of reflect that their campuses can be part of the learning experience for students, and that the transformation or the study of or the experience of the campus can be integral to their educational experience. And so the University of Minnesota has taken a living lab approach on several of our campuses for really the past decade and a half, and have tried to make campus spaces and locations available as a subject of study, as a place to do applied research and demonstration, and to really envision the campus environment as something that's not just a place in which you sort of pass through or experience in a passive way, but rather is part of the active learning experience, that it is in fact the subject of learning and subject of research. And so we've had examples of doing this in a lot of different contexts, whether this be like campus landscapes and stormwater. We've done it in the context of like energy systems and how do we make campus energy infrastructure available for, sort of research and experimentation and collaborations with faculty. And I mean that, kind of very broadly, like it's not just faculty in disciplines that are highly technical, but also thinking about um, sort of the social experience of a campus, or economic analysis of different approaches, or thinking about, sort of like more recently, we've been starting to have some conversations around biodiversity and, sort of the campus and the university as a large um, land steward. How do we, start to incorporate and work with our faculty to better understand sort of opportunities for advancing biodiversity through how we manage campus landscapes? So I think we have a history and a legacy of doing this, um, but the scale has been relatively small. And so as I think about the future ahead, one of the things that really intrigues me is this idea about how do we find ways to increase the scale of that kind of collaboration between students and faculty members and staff who are responsible for operating and maintaining the campus, and really taking advantage of this incredible resource that all of our university campuses have at their disposal. Um, and that really could be a way to enrich both the academic outcomes of the institution, but also to think about how do we accelerate the pace of change around building this fully sustainable future.
Well, thank you, Shane. It's so great to hear about your work at the U, and it's related to the energy transition and climate and pedagogy and all of the above. Thank you for your time, and thank you for being a resource, for the students and power systems journey. We really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. So thank you.